Believe it or not, that's not just a term I made up in the title. An illusory truth is a real philosophical concept that describes an idea that becomes more or less true depending on how many people believe it. For example, imagine a 4-lane highway. If people in the left lane notice that the cars in the right lane are moving faster, at least some percentage of them will make the logical choice to hop from one lane to the other. But as the condensation of traffic becomes redistributed, the more cars pile into the other lane, the more congested, and thus the slower the right lane's motion will become. And of course, we've all seen this work the other way also, as it's the baseline premise that our whole world and economies are built on. In a consumerist society, it doesn't matter what the actual empirical reality of any matter is. So long as you can convince the masses that it's in their best interests to move according to your design, then the system, and by proxy the world, can keep on turning, at least for another fiscal quarter or election cycle. As those who've been with this channel for any length of time will have heard so often that the words likely no longer sound real, when you really drill down to it, there are only two things that really drive people's actions: what they want and what they fear. That's why the carrot and the stick approach works just as well for motivating humans as it does a dog or any beast of burden. And I've also said before in circuitu that the ideal form of capitalism is as economic Darwinism. Remember that term, ideal form. We'll come back to it in a bit. Now, the reason I'm making this video is as either a prelude or an addendum, depending on what order I decide to release them in, to another wherein I lay out an argument for why technology, and more pertinently, the advanced industries which it enables, fundamentally undermines the concept of meritocracy by obfuscating the human effort behind any endeavor. But as I noted both before and after embarking on that socio-psycho expedition, it needs to be understood precisely why and how capitalism, and indeed economics overall, function and are supposed to function in order for its premise to carry its full potential weight. And it's this added context that I mean to add in this turn. So, to start off, if quote-unquote true communism, that is, communism in its ideal form, can be understood by Marx's original maxim, from each according to his ability, to each according to their needs, then the ideal form of capitalism can be understood by the similar code, from each according to his ability to each according to their contribution. If you've heard the story of the little red hen, this is essentially how capitalism is supposed to work. If you didn't contribute to the baking of the bread, then you don't get to help eat the bread, and vice versa. But here's the problem. The reason why ideal communism doesn't work in practice, which is to say, the reason it doesn't produce a healthy, functional society, is because it only appeals to those of lowest ability. Only the people who natively contribute less to the system than even the base costs of their own subsistence would be able to profit from that system. And therein lies the fundamental contradiction in our thinking. Production and supply doesn't actually generate value in an economy. Consumer demand does. Think about it. If the supply of something remains constant, but demand goes up, what happens to the price? It goes up. And if the supply remains constant but demand goes down, the price goes down in response, yes? But if demand remains constant and supply goes up or down, well then the correlation is inverted, isn't it? You see, value is a subjectively assigned quality, not an intrinsic property. It doesn't matter how much of something you have, or how objectively high or low its material quality. If nobody's willing or able to pay you for it, then it's worth nothing. And if nobody's willing or able to pay you more than what it cost you to make that thing in the first place, then nobody's going to waste their time, effort, or resources on its production, are they? And this is the critical point. Value is defined by how much work, which is a factor of human time and energy, people are willing to exchange for something. Working people exchange their finite time and energy for money. That money then can be exchanged for the products of other people's time and energy. In this way, having more money allows you to access and control a greater portion of the societal machine's net output. Therefore, everyone wants it and therefore are willing to make temporal laboral sacrifices in order to obtain it. But when the cost-reward ratio begins to invert, which is what inflation is, that's when people start to look for alternatives. It's when, historically, you'd begin to see great exodus migrations, revolutions, civil wars, literal cottage industries, as men would move out of society and set up their own isolated hermitages in the mountains. In short, individual people are every bit as mindful of their profit margins and investment returns as any corporate manager or finance executive. It's just their assets, their mediums of value exchange, that differ. Now, just as how communism doesn't work because its ideals foundationally conflict with our species' evolutionary firmware, ideal capitalism also doesn't work because contribution, i.e. the end product of a given amount of work, isn't actually what generates value, and thus paying people based on their incurred expenses is idiotic, hence the decidedly uncapitalistic expression, work smarter, not harder. Of course, here's where we come to the point I invoked by the title. Demand is based on perception, not tangible need. In my view, there exist two fundamentally separate layers to any economy. There's the mandatory sphere, which encompasses those unavoidable, unimpeachable expenditures every single body cannot escape incurring at some point: food, water, shelter, clothing, etc., and a second discretionary or luxury tier. This is where we find those vessels we most typically refer to when we speak about culture: fashion, accessories, entertainment, pleasure, etc. And it's here where we find the foundational contradiction of society, that one terminal fulcrum to which nearly every historical collapse can ultimately be attributed. In the natural world, value is a function of a thing's utility, i.e., what practical use I have for it, and you can't cheat or bribe or finagle your way out of a bad evolutionary strategy. You either have enough calories to live and sustain your present lifestyle, or you don't. There's no restructuring, no excusing, no borrowing against other assets, no repackaging, no refinancing, or any of this other modern monetary bullshit around caloric debts. A calorie, by the way, is a unit of metabolic heat generated through digestion of nutrients. And in the same way as money is representative of a change in human effort into usable products and/or services, a calorie itself cannot be eaten or used in place of the necessary nutrients that generated it. But here's the difference. Excess wealth, both in the caloric and monetary sense, is and has always been associated with individual worth, and therefore confers an amount of social status upon the holder. The presupposition being that they must have been competent enough to earn their excess fortunes, and therefore they're worth the time and effort to associate with. However, while this may have been true for our primitive pre-industrial Stone Age ancestors, when the pinnacle of technology was a hooked or flexible stick and bit of cord which could help you throw another pointy stick a lot further than you could with just your arm, and the correlation between human effort and productivity was actually more or less one-to-one. In the modern day, we've conflated influence for competence. This holds true for the media, the government, for investing and corporate governance. Whoever holds the purse strings is the one who's really in charge. And while, granted, the golden rule is as old as the concept of money itself, the real change has come in the obfuscatory complexity of the modern industrial apparatus. In short, our systems have become so complex, so convoluted, so infested with bloat that it becomes nearly impossible to distinguish the individual human beings from the apparatus in which they're enmeshed. This is why capitalism cannot function in our modern day. Nobody even can say for sure who's really in charge of anything anymore, let alone who's to blame or who gets to take credit for the dips, spikes, and turns, which is where the illusory truth, aka the media narrative machine, at last shows us its ugly mug. When people perceive an object or person as being of no practical or material use to them, then its value drops, as all living things have a powerful instinct to not spend time or energy for no reason. But beyond the tangible benefits of items like food and water, whose boons are based on chemical reactions, which are based in the immutable laws of physics, the social value of being the CEO, of having the fancy car or the diamond necklace, are transitory at best. 200 years ago, having a tan and big muscles was a sign of low status, as it signified a man who did manual labor. However, in the aftermath of the industrial transitions from manufacturing to service to tech industries, i.e. the broad societal movement from the field to the factory to the office, being scrawny and pale means that you're a menial salaryman or code monkey, and having the free time and energy and willpower to invest in getting swole is now the new, both literal and figurative, hotness. Plus, as it was the original criteria for a man's genetic fitness back in yon monkey years of yore, its resurgence as the litmus test for male attractiveness is not only perfectly natural, but inevitable. So in summary, much like how ideal communism doesn't work in real life because people will never be happy not owning the fruits of their own labors, ideal capitalism doesn't really work because people pay you based on the perceived utility of the product or service you provide them, not the amount of time and effort you invested in its production. Incidentally, this is also why centralized command economies, i.e. ones where the government nationalizes the means of production, don't work either. The powers that be have absolute control over the supply end of the equation. They have almost zero control over the demand portion, which is why it's imperative that these autocratic regimes also retain complete and total control of information and cultural output sources as well. Not just the media, but the schools, the church, the entertainment fields, academia, and so on. Anywhere people might come upon the idea that they don't need to just blithely accept whatever slop their feudal overlords deign to shovel into their trough. But in a world where social opinions and networks, rank and status, hold just as much weight in people's minds as tangible goods, and given that we are social, not scientific or rational animals, is it really any wonder that so many people are willing to sacrifice the latter for the former? And in the age of social media, where nearly everything you do and say is subject to intense scrutiny by strangers who have no tangible incentive to care about you beyond the transactional level, and in a world increasingly stratified and atomized by rampantly overbearing technology and oligarchic accretion, is it any real wonder that so many are just throwing up their hands and going, "What's even the point of it all anyway?" Which is where the illusory truths come into play. Just as how you can't hypnotize someone who knows it's happening and is actively resistant to your suggestive influence, propaganda, and marketing, which are just the social and commercial applications of misdirection and hypnotic suggestion, automatically loses circa 95% of their persuasion power when the audience is alerted to the simple fact of its influence, and the sole remaining power only works on the 5 to 10% of people who are tangibly invested in the preservation of the matrix and who will defy sanity and reason in an effort to prevent the sheep from breaking down the veiling fences. You can't convince people they want what they've already decided they don't. So the only alternative is to either convince them that everyone else wants the thing using our natural FOMO and status-seeking instincts against us, or to simply convince them that they have no other option, or that the other option is a slow and painful demise. You see, because economic value is conferred by demand and not supply, unlike in the natural world, which is governed purely by tangible, empirical, physical constraints and laws, society is governed by human perception and interpretation. So long as everyone thinks the system works, then it works, no matter how objectively poor its conditions get. It's only when people start to understand that the amount of effort they expend does not equal or exceed the amount of value they're getting out in exchange, and when they understand that it doesn't have to be this way, that's when we're bound to see actual, meaningful change to the status quo. Though whether it'll be for the better or the worse, only time and effort will determine. But that's all just my humble opinion as usual. Take it for what it's worth, and if you enjoyed, feel free to give us a like and subscribe, join up as a member, or check out my books on Amazon if you found any value in what I have to offer. Also, consider coming over to Discord, assuming I remember to update the link, or looking me up on alternate channels to stick it to old Big Brother YouTube. And until next time, my friends, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and always remember, there is no pain where strength lies. Peace be upon you.